So Donald Trump just did a pretty wide-ranging interview, and it was packed with some really bold claims and pretty ambitious policy ideas. We've gone through it all to boil it down to the absolute key takeaways for you. We're talking everything from a Golden Dome in Greenland to a cap on your credit card interest. So let's dive in and unpack what was said.
The whole thing kicked off with this statement right here, and wow, what a headline grabber. A whole new deal with Greenland. This quote, it really sets the stage for everything else that followed. A whole series of major claims that touch on national defense, foreign policy, and even your own wallet.
Okay, so to make sense of everything, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at this Greenland Golden Dome idea. Then, we'll get into assertive foreign policy actions. After that, managing the U.S. economy. And finally, the political scene. And at the end, we'll tie it all together to see the big picture.
All right, let's jump right in with part one, the Greenland Golden Dome. This was the huge announcement right at the start of the interview, laying out what sounds like a brand new strategic relationship.
So, what is the Golden Dome? Well, as it was described, it's a new missile defense system. And not just any system. Think Israel's famous Iron Dome, but, well, the direct quote was, Israel times probably 100. The key to it all, supposedly, is putting part of it in Greenland. That location is said to be the secret sauce for better accuracy and coverage against any incoming threats. So let's get into the specifics of this Greenland deal. The terms, as they were laid out, are pretty remarkable. We're talking total, unrestricted military access for the United States. No end date, no lease, and maybe most surprisingly, no direct cost to the U.S. In exchange, Greenland becomes a host for this critical Golden Dome system. Yeah, that's a huge departure from how these kinds of military base agreements usually work.
Okay, so from that big Greenland news, the conversation zoomed out to a much broader vision for foreign policy. And the theme here seems to be very assertive and, well, often unilateral action. This quote really sets the tone for this section. It introduces a series of claims about decisive military interventions. The prime example given was something called Operation Midnight Hammer, an operation that was said to have completely destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities in a single night. A huge claim, presented as something previous administrations just couldn't get done. And the list of major foreign policy successes didn't stop there. The elimination of ISIS founder al-Baghdadi was brought up, as was taking out Iranian General Soleimani. There was also mention of a more recent, but unspecified, operation in Venezuela that was described as a huge success. And then on the diplomatic side, it was claimed that direct pressure stopped Iran from executing more than 800 people. The focus then shifted to some of those long-standing alliances, particularly NATO. The perspective given was that NATO has basically been a one-way street, with the U.S. paying the bills and carrying the weight. And that led to a really provocative question. If the shoe was on the other foot and America was attacked, would our European allies really show up to help?
That whole idea of who's shouldering the burden internationally is a perfect segue into the domestic vision, specifically how America's money gets spent right here at home. So let's pivot to that, managing the U.S. economy. First, just to get a sense of scale, our proposed defense budget of $1.5 trillion for 2027 was put on the table. Now, with that kind of number in mind, it's not surprising that the conversation then turned to how to deal with the companies that get that money, the military contractors. And this slide really breaks down a new approach that was discussed. A line was drawn between a free market and what was called a stupid market. The argument went like this. It's stupid to let defense companies take huge profits and just do stock buybacks when the government desperately needs them to produce more weapons faster. So what's the solution offered? Direct government intervention. Just prohibit the buybacks and force them to put that money back into production. So where would all the money for these big plants come from? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle, according to the interview, is tariffs. The claim was made that tariffs are set to bring in over $600 billion in revenue just this year. All right, from those massive government numbers, the conversation zoomed way in, all the way down to your wallet. A proposal was floated to cap credit card interest rates at 10%. This was presented as a way to shield people from what were called destructive rates of 28, even 30%, and really give them a chance to get back on their feet.
And then a whole bunch of other positive economic stats were brought up, kind of rapid fire. A claim of $18 trillion in new investments coming into the country. Talk about the impact of a bill getting rid of taxes on tips, Social Security, and overtime. Gasoline prices were said to be down to $1.99 in many places. And finally, an inflation rate of just 1.2% over the last 3 months.
All right, so from the economy, the interview then pivoted to the political climate here at home, touching on everything from political opponents to the situation at the southern border.
So when the topic of political opposition came up, well, the language got pretty blunt. This quote really sums up the sentiment that was expressed, describing rivals as unfair fighters and even suggesting that, in a lot of cases, they might be mentally ill.
And on immigration and the border, there were really two key points made. First, the definitive statement that the southern border has been 100% closed. But right alongside that was the point that legal immigration is actually needed for the economy, to help new businesses find workers.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground here. Foreign policy, the economy, domestic politics. So what does this all mean when you put it together? Let's try to connect the dots and see what kind of big-picture worldview was presented.
You know, when you step back and look at all these different pieces, a pretty clear picture does start to emerge. It's really built on four main ideas. 1, a clear preference for decisive, go-it-alone action on the world stage. 2, not being afraid to intervene in the economy when it comes to national security. 3, consumer-focused financial policies with a real populist flavor. And 4, a very aggressive, very assertive stance against any political opposition.
And that really leaves us with the big question here, the one for you to think about. When you take this really unique mix of proposals, from a high-tech Golden Dome in Greenland all the way down to a 10% cap on credit cards, you can't help but ask, how would these ideas, if they actually became policy, reshape America, both at home and around the world? It's a question that definitely pushes back on our traditional ideas of how things work, and it's for sure something worth mulling over.